My son looked me in the eye and said, "You're nothing but a burden. I sold Dad's company, and now you can worry about paying rent." I didn't argue. I only smiled and replied, "All right, good luck." He believed he'd won. But when he and his wife landed in Milan and checked their accounts, the truth began to surface. That day had begun quietly. I was placing lilies into a glass vase, letting the scent fill the room, when I heard the growl of Caleb's Porsche outside. That car had become a warning bell to me. It never arrived without trouble. From the window, I saw him step out, Vanessa beside him, both walking with sharp determination. Their faces told me everything before a word was spoken. The bell rang, quick and sharp, no patience, no warmth. I opened the door. Caleb's eyes slid past mine, as if I were already gone. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. They walked straight into the living room, the space that had always been my safe corner, and turned it into a courtroom. I sat across from them as Caleb spoke, but it was Vanessa's eyes urging him on, her hand tightening on his arm. He declared he had sold the company, his father's company, our life's work. He spoke as though I were nothing, an old woman who should be grateful for whatever scraps he handed down. He said the money would be enough for me, enough to keep me comfortable. He slid the papers toward me, his lips curling in triumph. For a moment, my fingers trembled. I thought of Thomas, my husband, of the years we spent building that business together. Yet inside me something cooled, like steel hardening. I held the pen, signed where he wanted, and handed it back. Caleb leaned back, satisfied. Vanessa's smile carried a cruel edge. They thought the battle was theirs. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and said, "Good luck with the rent." His words were meant to sting, to humiliate. But I looked at him, calm as stone, and answered softly, "All right, good luck." They walked out believing I was defeated. They had no idea that what they thought they owned was only a shadow, that the real heart of the company lay safe beyond their reach. They had taken a shell and thought it a prize. I closed the door behind them, the silence in the house no longer heavy, but charged with a quiet fire. Their arrogance blinded them. They had just played into my hands, and the lesson waiting for them would not be forgotten. That night, as I sat in the stillness, I knew the game had only begun. When the front door closed behind Caleb and Vanessa, the quiet inside the house felt different. It wasn't the quiet of sadness. It was sharp, alive, almost waiting. I set the signed papers on the table, then picked up the phone and dialed the one person who had walked beside me through every storm, Marcus Holloway. He arrived quickly, still in his dark coat, his sharp eyes already guessing the truth before I said a word. He glanced at the papers, then at me, and sighed. "So, they finally went through with it." His voice wasn't shocked. It was steady, as if he had been expecting this day all along. We moved to the kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the air as I poured us each a cup. For a moment, we didn't speak. The warmth of the mug in my hands steadied me. Then I told him how Caleb had stood in that same room, convinced he had stripped me of everything. Marcus gave a small nod, the faintest smile touching his lips. "He never asked the right questions," he said. We opened the folder Marcus had been guarding for years. It held the structure my husband and I had carefully put in place long before. What Caleb believed he had taken was no more than a front, the surface business, the name, the day-to-day operations. It looked impressive on paper, but carried only a slice of the wealth. The real value, the foundation we had worked decades to protect, was untouched. Patents locked under international agreements, commercial properties spread across prime cities, and contracts secured under the Meridian Trust. All of it sat firmly under my control. Caleb hadn't touched a cent of it. He thought he had outsmarted me by pushing through a sale worth a couple million, yet all he had gained was a hollow shell. Marcus tapped one of the documents with his finger. 15 million, maybe more. He walked right past it. His words carried no gloating, only certainty. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it sink in. My son had believed he had won a victory, but all he had really done was prove his blindness. The room felt lighter then, not because the betrayal hurt less, but because the safety net I had woven years earlier was holding firm. Thomas and I had seen this weakness in Caleb, the hunger for shortcuts, the belief that charm and entitlement were enough. We had acted not out of mistrust, but out of foresight. Tonight, that choice protected everything we had built. I looked at Marcus across the table. "They think they left me with nothing," I said. He gave a slow, knowing nod. "Then let them enjoy that illusion." For now, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of patience, of plans waiting quietly in the dark. Caleb thought the game was over, but it had only just begun. The coffee on the table had gone cold, but neither Marcus nor I cared. He sat quietly, waiting, while I allowed my mind to travel back to the years when everything first began. People had always believed my husband, Thomas, was the driving force. He had the charm, the voice that filled rooms, the smile that won investors. That was the image the world loved to see. What they didn't notice was the woman at his side, keeping the wheels turning. It had been a man's arena back then, where my presence was often dismissed as decoration. I never argued. Instead, I let Thomas take the spotlight while I worked in the shadows. I drafted the contracts no one read closely, secured the land others overlooked, and filed patents that seemed unremarkable at first glance, but grew into the backbone of our fortune. People underestimated me, and I let them, because it was easier to build when no one saw your hands moving. Thomas and I often spoke late into the night about Caleb. Even when he was young, there had been warning signs. He liked the glitter of success, but never the work behind it. He dreamed about spending, never about creating. Thomas hoped he would grow out of it, but I could see the pattern forming. It was only a matter of time before he tried to take the easy path, and we had to be ready. That readiness became the Meridian Trust. To an outsider, it looked like a minor piece of paperwork, nothing more than another legal box checked. In truth, it was the lockbox for everything that mattered. Properties, contracts, innovations, all tucked safely away where reckless hands could not reach. It wasn't done with cruelty. It was protection, a promise that the years of sweat and sacrifice wouldn't crumble because of greed. As I spoke, Marcus listened without interruption. He had known much of it already, but I could see him studying my face, perhaps reminded of just how carefully the pieces had been set in place. Caleb never stood a chance of understanding, I said softly. He looks at numbers but not the story behind them. To him, I was nothing more than a lonely widow, too attached to flowers and old memories. He never realized I had been the architect all along, building foundations stronger than his ambitions could ever shake. He mistook silence for weakness and grief for blindness. In truth, I had been waiting. Marcus finally leaned forward, his voice low but firm. You did exactly what needed to be done. I nodded, more to myself than to him. The empire Thomas and I had raised was not just standing, it was untouchable. Caleb thought he had taken control, but the truth was, he had been playing on a stage I had designed. He was chasing shadows while the real power remained locked away, unseen and secure. The night was still when the phone rang, dragging me from sleep. The screen showed Caleb's name. I answered, already knowing why he was calling. His voice came through strained and uneven, not the confident tone he usually carried. Mom, something's wrong. The money isn't there, he blurted out. I let a pause stretch before replying in the calmest voice I could manage. I don't really understand these things, Caleb. Maybe you should call the bank directly. My words seemed to push him further into frustration. In the background I could hear Vanessa, her tone sharp, pressing him to make me sort it out. Minutes after the first call ended, another came. Then another. Each one more frantic than the last. Caleb's control was slipping, and for the first time, I could hear fear underneath his anger. He tried demanding, pleading, even raising his voice, but I stayed steady, answering with confusion, as though I was too old to grasp the situation. It was the role he had always cast me in, and now it worked against him. Vanessa eventually took the phone, her words cutting like knives. She shouted accusations, insisting I had ruined their future, that I was hiding something. I didn't respond to her rage. I only waited for Caleb to come back on the line. He always did. By the fifth call, his voice had dropped lower, no longer filled with fire, but weighed down by dread. Just tell me where it is, he begged, the arrogance gone. I let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. It's right where it has always been, Caleb. In my account. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but every word landed with force. You didn't sell the company. You sold only what you had, 30%. Nothing more. For a moment, I heard nothing but his breathing. Then a muffled sound, as if Vanessa had grabbed the phone again. But she said nothing. The silence on their end was louder than shouting. They were both realizing what those words meant. I did not rush to explain further. I let him sit with the truth, the reality that all his grand plans, all his boasting, had amounted to so little. His supposed victory was only a fraction of what he believed he controlled. Finally, he muttered, "That can't be true." But his voice betrayed him. He knew. Deep inside, he understood he had never seen the whole picture. I ended the call without another word, set the phone on the nightstand, and lay back in the darkness. Sleep did not return, but I didn't need it. I could already imagine their faces, the panic in a Milan hotel room when they realized everything had slipped through their fingers. The night was quiet again, but I knew it would not be quiet for them. Their nightmare had only begun. The next time the phone rang, there was no trace of calm on the other end. Vanessa's voice came first, sharp and full of fury. She hurled accusations, her words tumbling over each other, as if volume could change the truth. She shouted about lawyers, about courts, about dragging me through endless battles. I let her finish before answering in a steady voice. And how do you plan to pay for any of that? The silence that followed was heavy. I could almost picture her face tightening, the realization creeping in. Caleb came back on the line, his voice rough, trying to sound firm but cracking around the edges. He wanted me to explain, to give him a way out. Instead, I began naming things he never once asked about. The contracts signed under my authority, the developments he had ignored, the wealth tied securely beyond his reach. Each word I spoke was a door closing in front of him. Vanessa interrupted again, her tone now desperate instead of angry. She demanded to know how I had found out about their trip. That was when I delivered the sharpest truth of all. I told them that their suite in Milan, the one they thought they had booked with their winnings, had been arranged using money from an account Caleb had already drained without realizing it. They were living on funds that no longer belonged to them. The sound on the line shifted. Vanessa no longer yelled. She cried out in frustration, blaming Caleb, while he stayed quiet. I could hear them arguing faintly, the blame bouncing between them. When Caleb finally spoke again, his voice was lower, almost broken. He asked me what they were supposed to do. It was the first time I had heard my son sound like a child again, stripped of the confidence he had worn like armor. I didn't answer his question. I simply let the silence grow, because there was nothing I needed to add. He was learning the weight of his own choices. The calls kept coming over the next few hours. At first, they tried threats, then bargaining, then pleading. Each time, I spoke less and less. It wasn't my job to rescue them. They had put themselves in that place, far from home with cards that no longer worked and accounts showing nothing but red. By morning, the shift was complete. The two of them had gone from boasting and sneering to begging for relief. I listened without sympathy. For years, Caleb had looked at me and seen someone he could manipulate. Now he was seeing the truth, that he had never understood the strength of the person he was trying to outsmart. When I finally set the phone down, the house was quiet again. But in that silence, I knew the balance of power had changed forever. Caleb was no longer the one holding control. He had unraveled, thread by thread, until nothing was left but regret. When Caleb and Vanessa walked back into my house, the air carried their anger like a storm. Their clothes were the same fine brands, but their faces told the real story, tired, sour, and burned with humiliation. They hadn't returned by choice. They had been forced back, carrying the weight of failure across the ocean. The money that carried them home hadn't come from their efforts. Robert, my late husband's brother, had always envied our success. His jealousy made him reckless, and in his spite toward me, he sent Caleb just enough to crawl back. That detail alone showed me how desperate they were. They didn't sit this time. Caleb stood tall, trying to hide his defeat under a mask of rage. Vanessa lingered beside him, her arms folded tight, her eyes colder than before. He began with accusations, his voice shaking as he declared he would drag me into court, that he would prove I had tricked his father in his final days. He tried to paint me as a schemer, turning his failure into my crime. I didn't argue. Instead, I reached for the small recorder I had kept hidden in a drawer for years. I pressed play. Caleb's own voice filled the room, speaking words he had thought were private. His tone was smug, mocking me, calling me clueless, boasting to Vanessa about how easily he would get control over my accounts once the company was sold. Vanessa's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. Caleb tried to speak over the recording, but I turned the volume up. Another clip played, him laughing about how simple it would be to push me aside, certain that I was too old and too weak to stop him. Caleb's face paled, his lips tight, but I wasn't finished. The final recording was different. It wasn't Caleb's voice at all. It was Thomas's. His voice, steady and firm, cut through the room like a blade. Your mother could run circles around you. If you can't see that, you're not the son I thought you were. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything I could have said myself. Vanessa's expression changed completely. The contempt she had carried into my home turned into something sharper, betrayal. She looked at her husband as if she were seeing him for the first time, realizing the lies he had spun for her too. She stepped back, folding her arms tighter, her silence louder than any shouting could have been. Caleb stammered, trying to explain, but his excuses fell flat. The strength he had walked in with had drained away, leaving him smaller, cornered in his own arrogance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth had spoken for me, through his own words and his father's judgment. In that moment, Caleb had lost more than money or pride. He had lost the last shred of trust from the one person who had been willing to stand beside him. Vanessa didn't waste time. The moment the recordings ended, she turned on Caleb with words sharp enough to cut through the walls. She called him a liar, a coward, a man who had built his life on empty promises. He tried to calm her, but she refused to listen. Her voice rose higher until she grabbed her bag, stormed out the door, and slammed it behind her without looking back. The sound of her car pulling away was the final mark. She was gone, and their marriage was gone with her. Caleb stood in the middle of my living room, drained and alone. The man who once strutted with pride now looked like a boy who had lost everything. His shoulders sagged, his hands shook, and he stared at the floor as though searching for answers there. He didn't have any. That night, long after I thought the house had settled into peace again, the phone rang. It was Caleb. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of all arrogance. He asked if he could come back, if I would give him a roof. For a moment, I said nothing, letting him sit in his own silence. Then I told him the truth. Yes, he could stay, but not for free. I explained the rules clearly. He could have the spare room, but it came with a price, $50 a night and chores around the house. I wanted him to understand that nothing was handed over without effort. He hesitated, his voice cracking as he complained that he didn't have the money. That was the first real moment of honesty between us. I didn't soften. I told him plainly, "Then you'll need to find a way to earn it." There was no sympathy in my tone, only fairness. He had lived too long in comfort built by others, never once realizing the value of what he enjoyed. Now the choice sat in front of him like an open door. He could leave, holding on to his anger and pride, but with nothing to show for it. Or he could stay, accept the conditions, and begin again from the ground up. It wasn't about the rent or the chores. It was about discipline, about proving he could build instead of just take. On the other end of the line, I heard his breathing grow heavier. He wanted to argue, but no words came. For the first time, Caleb had no one else to blame and no shortcuts to hide behind. He knew it too. When I ended the call, the night was quiet again. I didn't know which path he would choose, but I had given him the only offer that mattered. If he returned, it would be on my terms. If he refused, then he would learn what it meant to truly stand alone. Either way, the decision was his, and his life would never be the same. A few days later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Caleb stood there, no car behind him, no wife at his side, only a single battered suitcase in his hand. His face was tired, his voice low. Without a word, he stepped inside. He accepted the spare room, not as a son returning home, but as a man starting over under rules he could no longer bend. The first morning set the tone. I handed him a list, basic things that had always been ignored when he lived a life of comfort. The grass needed cutting, the gutters clearing, the garage sweeping. He didn't protest, though the look on his face showed how foreign the tasks were to him. By noon, his shirt was soaked, his back bent from labor he had never known. The polished shoes and crisp suits had been traded for worn sneakers and old work clothes. Soon after, I introduced him to a contractor I trusted, a man who needed extra help. It wasn't glamorous work, it was lifting, hauling, digging under the hot sun. Caleb reported there early each day, returning in the evenings with calloused hands and shoulders sore from effort. He earned his wages by the hour, watching coins gather slowly instead of the quick fortune he once demanded. His wardrobe changed almost overnight. The tailored jackets and silk ties were sold off piece by piece, exchanged for cash to cover small necessities. Each time he parted with another symbol of his old life, I saw a bit of the arrogance leave with it. What remained was a young man learning the taste of struggle for the first time. Evenings were quiet in the house. He would drag himself to the kitchen table, too tired to posture, too worn to argue. There were no speeches about big deals or grand plans, only silence broken by the sound of a fork against a plate. In those moments, I saw something unfamiliar in him. Not pride, not bitterness, but humility. He began to notice small details that had once escaped him. The price of groceries, the effort behind a clean floor, the weight of a single dollar in his palm. It wasn't sudden, but day by day, the lesson sank deeper. I watched all of it unfold without lecture. I didn't need to tell him he was changing. His eyes said enough. They no longer carried the shine of entitlement. They held fatigue, yes, but also the slow, steady understanding that nothing in life came free. Caleb had arrived at my doorstep with nothing but a suitcase. What he was carrying now was heavier, the beginning of responsibility. For the first time, he was earning instead of taking, and though the work broke him down, it was also building something inside him he had never known before. The weeks stretched into months, and I watched Caleb without saying much. He rose early, left for long hours, and came back worn from labor that left him no energy for arguments. His hands grew rough, his shoulders stronger, and though the work was simple, he carried it out without complaint. The restless arrogance that once clung to him seemed to have faded into something quieter. One evening, as I reviewed documents in my study, I found myself thinking of him differently. He had managed to survive the lowest point of his life, and instead of running, he had stayed. That was when I decided it was time to test him with something more. The next morning, I called him in and told him about an opening at Meridian Trust. It wasn't a glamorous position, just a junior role where he would be expected to follow orders and prove his worth among people who owed him nothing. There would be no special treatment, no shortcuts, and his name alone would carry no weight. If he wanted it, he had to show up and work as any other newcomer would. Caleb agreed without hesitation. I could see nerves flicker across his face, but he didn't argue. His first day was almost comical to watch from a distance. The employees who once feared he might sweep in and cut them out now saw him fumbling with tasks, asking questions, and stumbling through systems he had never cared to understand before. There were no tailored suits this time, no audience to impress, just hard lessons and the need to prove himself. Slowly, something shifted. He stopped expecting guidance and started seeking it. He listened closely to supervisors, respected their knowledge, and put effort into tasks most would overlook. Mistakes were frequent, but instead of throwing blame, he corrected them with determination. I noticed how his co-workers, once wary, began to accept him. Respect grew, not because of his name, but because he was finally earning it. Watching him, I saw qualities I hadn't recognized before. Beneath the arrogance had always been a sharp mind, but it had been buried under entitlement. Now, with no illusions left, he used it differently. He asked the right questions, looked for solutions, and paid attention in a way he never had when his only focus was wealth. At home, the conversations between us changed. He no longer spoke as a son trying to prove me wrong. He listened when I explained strategy, asked for advice, and treated me with a seriousness that surprised me. For the first time, he didn't see me as just his mother. He saw me as the one guiding the company, and he respected the role. Caleb was not yet the man Thomas had hoped he would become, but for the first time, I saw a path opening. The boy who once mocked the value of work was now learning its weight, step by step, inside the company that was built for more than greed. Half a year passed, and the change in Caleb was clear. The careless man who once chased easy wealth no longer stood before me. In his place was someone who had worked his way through the company step by step, proving himself with effort rather than entitlement. When the time came, he earned the role of director of operations, not because of his name, but because his work spoke for him. We sat across from each other in a bright conference room after closing a deal with a client that he himself had helped secure. His analysis had been sharp, his approach professional. He looked at me and, for the first time in years, gratitude filled his eyes. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said. Not long after, Vanessa reached out. Her voice carried none of the old sharpness. She admitted she had been driven by greed and told Caleb she was ending their marriage. More surprising than her apology was her decision to walk away without demanding a cent. For once, Caleb accepted it without bitterness. Later that evening, he spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. He said he finally understood what his father had wanted from him, and that he was beginning to feel like the kind of man Thomas would respect. It wasn't pride in the old sense, it was something steadier, more grounded. I realized then that the real victory had nothing to do with money or revenge. It was in watching my son step out of the shadow of arrogance and into the man he was meant to be. I had risked losing him to teach him a lesson he desperately needed, and against all odds, it worked. He had found himself again, and this time the change was real.